The call came at 4:37 in the afternoon. I was still in my work clothes, pencil skirt, blazer, the low heels I'd worn to the quarterly review, when my body decided it was done pretending everything was fine. One moment, I was standing in the parking garage of Harmon and Associates, keys in hand. The next, the concrete was rising toward me, and a stranger was kneeling beside my face, saying, "Stay with me, stay with me. Can you hear me?" I could hear her. I just couldn't answer. The paramedics told my husband later that my blood pressure had dropped so fast they were genuinely worried about internal bleeding. I've been ignoring the pain in my abdomen for 3 days. I'm an accountant, not a doctor, but I'm also the kind of person who schedules everyone else's appointments and forgets her own. My husband, Daniel, had been telling me since Tuesday that something was wrong. I told him I was just tired. I told him it was work stress. I told him I'd rest over the weekend. It was Thursday. Daniel is always my emergency contact. He has been since the day we got married 6 years ago. I never listed my parents, not because I don't love them. I did, for a long time, in the complicated way you love people who taught you that love comes with conditions you have to keep earning. I listed Daniel because Daniel is the person who shows up. That distinction matters more than I knew. So when the paramedics called, they called him. He left a client meeting mid-sentence, didn't stop to grab his jacket, and was at Mercy General before I was even fully conscious. I remember opening my eyes and seeing his face and thinking, okay, I'm going to be all right. What I didn't know, what Daniel would tell me later, after the doctor had explained the ovarian cyst and the emergency surgery I needed, after I'd signed my own consent forms with my own hand, because I was a conscious adult, and that is how medical consent works, was that he'd also called my mother. He did it out of courtesy. That was the word he used when he told me, courtesy, because despite everything, he knew I would have wanted her there. He called her at 5:03 p.m. and told her I had collapsed, that I was at Mercy General, that I needed surgery within the next few hours. My mother said, "Oh my goodness, is it life-threatening?" Daniel said the doctors were concerned, yes. My mother said, "Okay, but here's the thing. Your brother-in-law just called and Marcus's venue deposit fell through." For those of you who don't know Marcus, he is my younger brother. He is 28 years old. He has never held a job for longer than 14 months. He is getting married in the spring to a woman named Jolene, and their wedding, the venue, the catering, the flowers, the rehearsal dinner, is being funded almost entirely by my parents. Which is to say, it is being funded almost entirely by me because for the past 4 years I have been sending my parents $1,800 every single month. I'll come back to that number. My mother told Daniel that the venue Marcus had originally booked had just canceled due to a double booking situation, and Marcus and Jolene were, quote, absolutely devastated, and she and my father needed to drive out to meet them and help them find a solution tonight, because the kids were falling apart. Daniel said, "Linda, Claire is in the emergency room." My mother said, I know, and I feel terrible. But is she awake? Is she stable?" Daniel said yes. My mother said, "Then she's going to be fine. She's young and healthy. Marcus really needs us right now. We'll come by tomorrow morning, first thing. I promise." Daniel stood in the hallway of Mercy General, outside the room where his wife was being prepped for emergency surgery, and listened to his mother-in-law explain that a wedding venue problem took priority. He told me later that he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "Okay, Linda," and he hung up. He didn't tell me that night. He sat beside my bed through the pre-op, held my hand until they wheeled me back, and was in the waiting room for the 2.5 hours I was in surgery. When I woke up in recovery, he was the first face I saw. Again, I asked him if my parents were there. He said they'd called and sent their love. I nodded and looked at the ceiling and didn't say anything because somewhere under the anesthesia fog I already knew. I already knew the way you know things you've been pretending not to know for years. They came the next morning at 10 a.m. as promised. My mother brought a fruit basket, and my father patted my hand twice and said, "You gave us quite a scare, kiddo." My brother texted a string of heart emojis. No one mentioned the venue. No one mentioned the phone call. My mother told me 3 separate times that I needed to slow down and take better care of myself, which I found extraordinary given the circumstances. I was in the hospital for 2 nights. Daniel was there every hour he wasn't absolutely required elsewhere. My best friend Priya came both evenings and brought me real food from the Thai place I like and watched TV with me and made me laugh until my incision hurt. My parents visited once for 45 minutes on that first morning. My father had a golf game in the afternoon. On the second night, lying in the dark while Daniel slept in the chair beside me, I did something I had never let myself do before. I added it up. Not emotionally. Mathematically. The way I do things, because I am an accountant and numbers are the language I trust most. I started sending money to my parents 4 years ago when my father's back injury forced him into early retirement and my mother called me crying, saying they didn't know how they were going to manage. I was 29. Daniel and I had just bought our house. One daughter is the darker. One daughter. And I thought it would be temporary. $1,800 a month for 41 months. That is $73,800. On top of that, I paid the down payment on their car when their old one died, $6,400. I paid for my mother's knee surgery out of pocket when her insurance fell short, $4,100 after what insurance covered. I flew home and paid for everything when my grandfather passed, because my parents said they simply didn't have it. $3,200 for the funeral, $800 for flights and hotels for their side of the family. I paid 2 months of Marcus's rent when he got fired from his third job, $2,400, and bought him a laptop for his freelance business, $1,100, and gave him $500 for a certification course that I am fairly certain he never took. On the night before my brother's engagement party, which my parents hosted at their house, which is maintained by my monthly transfers, I wired $3,000 to cover the catering, because my mother called and said they'd underestimated the headcount and weren't I so excited for Marcus and Jolene. I was excited. I wired the money. Total, lying in that hospital bed with my phone calculator, $95,300, nearly $100,000 over 4 years, and when I collapsed alone in a parking garage, my parents chose a venue problem. I want to be careful here, because I'm not someone who gives gifts and then holds them over people. I gave that money because I wanted to help. I gave it freely. The money is not the point. The point is the phone call. The point is Daniel's voice when he finally told me what my mother had said. 3 days after I got home. When I pressed him. When I told him I knew he was protecting me, and I needed to hear it. The point is that I lay there and replayed every time I had been the one who dropped everything. The time Marcus called me crying at 2 a.m. because Jolene was upset with him, and I talked him through it for an hour. The time my mother had a health scare and I drove 4 hours round trip on a Tuesday because I couldn't stand the thought of her being afraid alone. The time my father needed someone to go with him to his specialist appointment and I rescheduled 2 client meetings to make it happen. I was always available. I was always the one who came. And when it was my turn, the answer was, "Is she stable? Then it can wait." I went back to work 3 weeks later. I didn't say anything to my parents. I smiled at Sunday dinners and asked about the wedding planning and listened to my mother describe the new venue they'd found. Lovely, actually, better than the first. And I kept sending the $1,800 every month. And I didn't say anything to anyone except Daniel, who listened and held my hand and said, very carefully, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But I think you already know what you need to do." He knows me well. The thing I knew I needed to do, I just wasn't ready to do yet. Because there is a difference between knowing something and being ready to let it change everything. And I had spent so long being the family's safe place to land that I wasn't sure who I was if I stopped. Priya was less patient than Daniel. "Claire," she said over dinner about a month after I got home, "you paid for the party where they announced the engagement. You are currently funding the wedding. Your mother chose that wedding over your surgery. I don't know what you are waiting for." I said I was waiting to be sure. Priya put down her fork. "Sure of what?" I didn't answer. But I think what I was waiting for was permission. Not from anyone else, but from myself. Permission to stop. Permission to stop. Permission to say, I have given enough, and what I gave was not valued, and I am allowed to close this account. The permission came 6 weeks later, at Marcus and Jolene's engagement party. My parents had planned it at the Harrington, a mid-range event space about 20 minutes from their house. I had contributed $2,500 to the cost. It was a Saturday evening, 70 or so people, past appetizers and a DJ and the kind of fairy lights that are draped over everything now. Jolene looked beautiful. Marcus looked happy. I wore a green dress. Daniel said made me look like I owned the room. About an hour in, my mother pulled me aside near the bar and said, very quietly, "Honey, I wanted to talk to you about the next few months. With the wedding coming up, there are going to be some extra expenses. We were thinking, if you could maybe bump up the monthly amount temporarily, just through the summer, it would really help us stay on top of everything." I looked at her. She smiled in the way she always does when she's asking me for something. Warm, slightly worried, certain I will say yes. I said, "How much are you thinking?" She said, "Even another 400 or 500 would make such a difference." I said, "Mom, I'm going to stop the transfers after this month." The smile didn't disappear so much as freeze. "What?" "I'm stopping the monthly transfers. After this month's payment, I won't be sending any more." She stared at me. Around us, the party continued. Someone laughed loudly near the DJ booth. A waiter passed with a tray of shrimp. And my mother stood very still and said, "Claire, what are you talking about? We depend on that." I said, "I know." She said, "Is this about the hospital?" "Because we explained." "I know you explained," I said. "I'm not angry, Mom. I'm just done." She started to cry quietly, the way she does when she wants to make sure you understand the weight of what you've done to her. I had seen it many times. I used to feel like the ground was dropping out from under me when she cried. That night, I felt something else. Something very quiet and very solid. Like a foundation I hadn't known was there. I got her a glass of water. I told her I loved her. I went back to Daniel on the other side of the room. He looked at my face and said, "How'd it go?" I said, "I'll tell you in the car." My father found me 20 minutes later, near the dessert table. He was not crying. He was doing the other thing, the thing he does when he is trying to be imposing. Standing too close, lowering his voice, using my full name. "Claire Elizabeth, your mother is very upset." "What exactly did you say to her?" I said. "I told her I'm ending the monthly transfers." He said, "You can't do that. I want to pause here because that sentence tells you everything you need to know about how my family has thought about this arrangement. Not, 'Please reconsider,' or 'We really depend on you.' You can't do that. As though it were not my money. As though it were not my choice." I said, "I can, actually." He said, "After everything we've done for you," I said, "Dad, I love you, but I need you to think carefully about what you're about to say." He looked at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said, "This is not the time or place for this conversation." I said, "I agree. We can talk next week if you want, but my decision isn't going to change." He walked away. I got a piece of chocolate cake and it was excellent. Marcus found me near the end of the evening, He had clearly been briefed by our parents, because he came over with a specific expression. Wounded, confused, the face of someone trying to understand what they did wrong. "Hey," he said. "Is everything okay? Mom seems really upset." I love my brother. I want to say that clearly, because everything that followed is not about not loving him. I love him the way you love someone you grew up with. Someone who is part of your earliest memories. Someone whose laugh you recognize from across any room. I also know that Marcus has never once asked how I am doing. Not after the surgery. Not in the 3 weeks I was recovering. Not in the 6 weeks since. He had not thought to wonder whether I might need anything, because in our family, I was the one who provided. It had never occurred to him to look in my direction with that question. I said, "Everything is fine. Congratulations on the engagement. Jolene is wonderful." He said, "Are you really stopping the payments to Mom and Dad?" I said, "Yes." He said, "But the wedding," I said. "Marcus, I love you, but the wedding is your wedding. It's not my financial responsibility." He looked genuinely stunned. And I thought about how strange it is, how we build these structures inside families, these unspoken arrangements, and the person carrying the weight is the last one to be allowed to say, "It's heavy. I just don't understand," he said. "You've always hoped." "I know," I said. "And now, I'm going to hope differently. I'll be at your wedding. I'll bring a real gift. I'll dance with you at the reception, and I'll cry when you say your vows, because I love you and I want you to be happy. But I'm not funding it anymore." He didn't have anything to say to that. Eventually, he nodded, slowly, like someone absorbing information in a language they're only beginning to learn. Daniel found me a few minutes later. He slipped his hand into mine without asking anything, which is one of the 10,000 reasons I chose him. We left at 9:30. In the car, I told him everything. The conversation with my mother, the one with my father, the one with Marcus. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. "Sad," I said. "But not sorry." He said, "That sounds about right." The drive home took 25 minutes. When we pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car for a moment longer than I needed to, looking at the house Daniel and I bought together. The one with the porch light on and the garden I keep meaning to get to, and the life that is, I realized, entirely and solidly mine. My mother called 4 times that week. I called her back once and we talked for an hour and it was hard. And she cried, and I held the phone and felt the guilt move through me like weather. Real, present, and then passing. I told her again that I loved her, and I was not abandoning her. I told her the monthly transfers were not returning. I told her I hoped we could find a different way forward. She said she didn't understand how I could do this to my family. I said, "I know it feels that way." She said, "After everything," I said, "Mom, I have given you $95,300 in 4 years. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it so that neither of us can pretend I haven't shown up for this family. I have. And when I needed you to show up for me, you made a different choice. I have to live with that. And I have to make decisions based on what's actually true." She was quiet for a long time. I said, "I love you. I'll talk to you soon." Then I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed and took a breath. And another. Daniel came in from the hallway. He didn't say anything. He just sat down next to me and we stayed there for a while, not talking, in the house with the porch light on. Here's what I want to say to anyone watching who recognizes something in this story. Not the specific details, but the shape of it. The way you can become someone's financial safety net and emotional support system and calendar manager and crisis responder, and do it out of love, genuinely, and still somehow never be the person they drive to the hospital for. You are not obligated to keep giving to people who have demonstrated, clearly and repeatedly, that your emergencies are optional. That is not cruelty. That is not selfishness. That is the most basic form of self-respect. And you are allowed to have it even if your family taught you otherwise. I don't know what happens next with my parents. The wedding is in 4 months, and I genuinely do not know what the holidays will look like or whether my mother and I will find our way back to something real. I hope we do. I hope, maybe, that losing the financial arrangement opens space for something more honest. A relationship where I'm a daughter, not a resource. But I'm done waiting for that hope to be convenient for everyone else. Last Saturday, Daniel and I went to the farmer's market and spent $40 on things we didn't need. Fancy honey, a small succulent. Bread from the bakery stand that we ate in the car on the way home. I laughed at something he said and got crumbs on my coat, and it was, unremarkably, one of the best mornings I'd had in years. That evening, I looked at my bank account and did not move $1,800 anywhere. I left it where it was. It felt, if I'm being honest, like finally being able to breathe all the way down. There is a version of this story where I stay silent. Where I keep sending the money, keep showing up, keep being the person everyone calls when they need something. And no one calls when I'm the one who needs something. I lived that version for 4 years. I know exactly what it costs. What happened to Claire is not unusual. It happens slowly, the way most quiet damage does. You say yes once because you love someone. You say yes again because it would hurt them if you didn't. And somewhere in the middle of all that saying yes, the people around you stop asking and start expecting. And you stop being a person to them and start being a function. The bank. The fixer. The one who handles it. The thing about living that way is that it doesn't announce itself as a problem. It feels like love. It feels like loyalty. Claire gave nearly $100,000 to her family because she wanted to, because they needed help, and she had the means to provide it. That impulse is not wrong. Generosity is one of the finest things a person can offer. But generosity without boundaries teaches people the wrong lesson. It teaches them that your resources are unlimited, that your needs are secondary, that the arrangement can continue indefinitely without reciprocity. And when you have spent years teaching that lesson, the people who love you, and they do love you, in their limited way, genuinely do not understand why the lesson is suddenly changing. That is what Claire's father meant when he said you can't do that. He wasn't being cruel. He was describing the world as he understood it, the world Claire had built for him through 4 years of consistent behavior. She had taught him that her answer was always yes. He had learned the lesson well. The moment she changed the lesson, everything shifted, not because she raised her voice, or made a scene, or punished anyone, but because she told the truth quietly and held her ground when it became uncomfortable. That is harder than any argument. Arguments can be won or lost. Quiet certainty cannot be argued with. One daughter is a docker. One daughter is a docker. Is the hospital room. The moment she opened her eyes, and the first face she saw was her husband's. Not because he was obligated to be there, not because someone shamed him into it, but because he chose to be there. Simply the way people choose things when they actually love you. That is what real presence looks like. And it stands in such sharp contrast to a fruit basket, delivered the next morning, to a father who had a golf game in the afternoon. We don't always get to choose our families, but we do get to choose what we accept, what we fund, and where we place our energy. Those choices, made consistently over time, shape the life we actually end up living, rather than the one we keep meaning to build. Claire is not a cautionary tale about family. She is a reminder that intelligence without courage changes nothing. You can understand exactly what is happening to you and still stay stuck inside it. Because understanding is not the same as acting. The moment she acted, the moment she sat in that hospital bed with her phone calculator and let the number become real, was the moment the story began to change. She chose finally to extend to herself the same care she had spent years extending to everyone else. That is not the end of anything. That is a beginning.